All right. So this evening, I can't help myself but not get out of Zosima and Alyosha, even though I said we would move into the book on Mitya, on Dmitri tonight. As I left class and just things happened at work and even here at church, and just kind of ruminating on what's going on in this section and what happens the second half of the book. Just to give you a preview, as we do get into the last half of the book, our focus is going to be on Alyosha's relationship with the school children. And way back at the beginning of the summer, when we first started the class, I had recommended an article. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of the article, but it was by Donald Sheehan. And it was about memory eternal, and how the Orthodox understanding of memory eternal kind of is the key to understanding Brothers Karamazov. And so as we get into the second half of the book, if you have not read that article, and if you have difficulty finding it, please email me and I'll send you a link, because we'll actually use Sheehan's conversation as we go through the second half of the book, and we look at that relationship that does exist between Alyosha and the school children, and where the novel ends, right? This is a novel about a murder, but it's not really a mystery, and it wasn't intended to be a mystery, right? It really was intended to be a searching out of the human soul. And that's really what Dostoevsky does. He'd been doing it his entire career. Um, and he even intended to write one further novel beyond this, which he considered would have been his magnum opus, that would have kind of drawn together all the themes that he had been working on throughout his literary career. But unfortunately, he died before he was able to write that. But a lot of what he would have put in the magnum opus is actually contained in Brothers Karamazov. So those ideas and those thoughts are there, and his thoughts on the human person, on the human soul, are really born out of his own personal history and his own struggles. You know, beginning with his ideological struggles when he was young, through the kind of the dark years of the Siberian Gulag, um, the labor camp, and coming coming back to himself, right? He really, to use the parable of the prodigal son, Dostoevsky really came to his senses in Siberia. And in his letters to his brother, you see that coming to his senses. And he really does talk about the depth of the human person. And that really is what he explores throughout the rest of his literary career. Certainly with Brothers Karamazov, he's exploring the depth of the human person and the relationship, as we've said before, between faith and doubt, right? Something that he certainly experienced in his own life, and he saw the people of Russia of his day experiencing as well. And that is why Zosima really is the heart of the book, and it really is why, for me, it's difficult to get out of the heart of the book, because there's so much there. But there are a couple things that we've touched on the last couple of weeks, a couple of threads that I want to pull on even a little more deeply than we've been able to over the last 2 or 3 weeks. So we're going to be on page 313, chapter 3, from Talks and Homilies of Elder Zosima. In the old edition, 332 is where we're going to be picking up in the newer edition. And this again comes from the section, some words about the Russian monk and his possible significance. A few weeks ago, we started here and kind of went somewhere else, which was good and great. And then last week, we skipped over a few things here that I want to come back to and pull some thoughts together. And I want to share a writing of a contemporary of Dostoevsky with you. And again, I wasn't able to check the title today in my busyness at work. In between, so we had to take Jackson back to the surgeon this morning. He had surgery in January on his one of his hips. I can't remember which one now. Now he's having surgery on the other hip next Tuesday. We went to the surgeon and figured that all out this morning. So first thing in the morning, went to work, and then it's been a whirlwind since. And I meant to check the title because there's several titles that you can find from Saint Theophan the Recluse, who was a 19th century bishop, and then as his title bears witness to, later on became a recluse in his later life, but continued his pastoral ministry through the writing of letters. And so there's several books that you can find now from St. Theophan. I highly recommend, if you can get a hold of the writings, any of the writings of St. Theophan, that you do. One of them is called The Path to Salvation. Again, and it deals with the life in Christ from its beginning, whether that's at infancy, those that are born in the church, baptized in the church from infancy, and what that might look like, and how to safeguard faith in children that are born in the church. And then he picks it up again and says, but most of us, our experiences somewhere along the way, we kind of get off path, off track, and he talks about the life of repentance and what that looks like. And the spiritual warfare is a big topic in that book. I highly recommend The Path to Salvation. He's got another one that's called, and I think this is the title of the book that I'm thinking of. If any of you know that I'm wrong, please correct me. But I think the book I'm thinking of is called The Spiritual Life and How to Be Attuned to It. And that is actually a collection of letters from Saint Theophan to one of his spiritual daughters. And it's correspondence, but we don't really have her letters, we have his letters. So we don't have the letters that she was writing to him, but we have his responses to his spiritual daughter who had moved to Moscow. And her questions to Saint Theophan was, how do I keep the faith moving to a city like Moscow and the hustle and bustle and the things that I'm going to come in contact? She grew up, provincially, kind of in a place similar to what we're reading about here in Brothers Karamazov. She had grown up a simple life with a simple faith, but was moving to Moscow, and the correspondence between the two, again, St. Theophan is encouraging her how to live the spiritual life, right? The spiritual life and how to be attuned to it. One of his exhortations, encouragements, or even warnings that he gives this young lady as she's moving to Moscow is about her interactions with the people that she's going to come in contact with. And he's setting her up for the disappointment that she is going to face as she moves into city life and as she begins to work and live in the city of Moscow. And basically what St. Theophan tells her is you need to understand in your interactions with most people only care about you as far as they can get something from you. That in your interaction with people, you need to understand that pretty much it's going to be a relationship of expediency. And do not let that cause you discouragement or despair. He's kind of warning her, this is going to be your experience. Most people, even though they may seem to care about you, even though they may talk like they care about you, the reality of the fact is those people really don't care about you. They care about you as far as they can use you, and then when that is over, they'll move on, right? And basically that encouragement, warning, whatever it may be to her is, being careful to guard her heart and not to unduly put her trust in others, but to put her trust solely in Christ. He wasn't saying don't engage with other people. He was just saying be careful and be aware as you engage with other people. As we move into the second half of the book, as Alyosha actually goes into the world and he begins to live out the obedience that the Elder Zosima has given him, what we see with Alyosha is someone who has learned to guard his heart and understands that most people are in one form or they're using each other because they are hurting themselves, right? And so as you move into the next book after Zosima, the exchange between Alyosha and Grushenka, right? That whole exchange is a good example of what St. Theophan was talking about. Radican and Grushenka, at first, their whole thought about Alyosha is they were going to use Alyosha for their own entertainment and their own pleasure, right? Grushenka not realizing that as Alyosha came to the house that night, he was in the midst of his own kind of spiritual struggle with the death of Zosima. And because he was an early lover of man, even though he was struggling with that, as they began interacting, he showed her mercy, right? And she in turn showed him mercy. And that interaction transformed what was happening in the moment and really was kind of a transformative moment for Alyosha in his own struggle with what was going on with the elder, right? Rakitin, that wasn't the case for Rakitin, right? He doesn't change because all Rakitin cares about is using other people for his own devices, right? Ivan is a similar character in the novel. He's someone who uses others. He uses Smerdyakov, right? You know, maybe even subconsciously to himself, he uses Smerdyakov. Now I'm gonna spoiler warning, right? We're getting close to the end of the summer though. Smerdyakov is the one who actually murdered the father, right? And Smerdyakov is the bastard son, right? That Fyodor Karamazov had with stinking Elizaveta, right? And Ivan, through his conversations with Smerdyakov, right, kind of subconsciously puts it into Smerdyakov's mind, the idea that he plays out. It's Dmitri that gets blamed for it because it's Dmitri that had the open argument and conflict going on with Fyodor Karamazov. And even how Dmitri responds to that. Again, it plays into that larger thing that St. Theophan was talking about in our interactions with one another. And that's kind of at the heart of what Zosima is talking about in this section of the novel when he's talking about how we deal with other people, right? So with all that said, we're going to back up a little bit. We're going to talk about the spiritual virtues of obedience, fasting, and prayer that Zosima hits on here. We're going to look a little bit more at the statement that we looked at last week, where Zosima says prayer is education, and talk a little bit about the power of prayer. And then where I'd like to finish tonight is get to the chapter Cana of Galilee and actually look at that in depth with one another and see kind of the moment for Alyosha where he comes out of his spiritual crisis. All right, so again, old version, we're on page 313, new version is 332. We're going to start, it's the second paragraph of that chapter, and I want to read a little bit about it. And there's a lot going on in this chapter, right? Through Zosima, Dostoevsky is kind of pushing back against things that were current in 19th century Russia and ideas that were popular and current at the time. And through Zosima, he's kind of giving the antidote to the ideas that were floating around, right? And so we'll take a look at that, maybe make some application to our own culture and our own day, and then move forward, like I said. So the paragraph begins, it says, "Thus I think of the monk, and can my thinking be false? Can it be arrogant? Look at the worldly, and at the whole world that exalts itself above the people of God. Are the image of God and his truth not distorted in it? They have science, and in science only that which is subject to the senses. But the spiritual world, the higher half of man's being, is altogether rejected, banished with the sword of triumph, even with hatred. The world has proclaimed freedom, especially of late. But what do we see in this freedom of theirs? Only slavery and suicide." Now again, if we take that statement, Zosima is talking about 19th century Russia, right? Scientism and rationalism, um, socialism that was quickly turning into communism, right? All the isms that were circulating around in 19th century Russia. And, he makes the statement, they've declared freedom from God, but really all it's led to is slavery and suicide. Now you look at our culture today. Our culture has declared freedom from God. And the result is the same, slavery and suicide. We really do live in a culture of death. We live in a culture that's afraid of death, but also fascinated with it, right? It's this weird relationship that exists within our culture. And we live in a culture that is ruled by science, right? In a science that is dominated by the senses, but in a culture that has forgotten the higher half of man, as Zosima says here. Yes?
Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that the West is in love with as many choices as it can get. And it's like the Bruce Springsteen song, 57 channels with nothing on. So there's like an infinite amount of choices, and being able to choose is the most important thing in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was his critique.
But it leads to slavery, right?
Which leads, yeah.
And Zosima is going to get to a point where he's going to talk about how we attain freedom, right? Even like so, Springsteen, 57
channels.
57 channels, but nothing on. But most of us are so enslaved to it that we can't stop clicking the channels, right? Today I heard a comment of someone, and it made me think of another contemporary song by 21 Pilots. They were saying that they had engaged in this spiritual retreat, and it was a weekend of silence, if you will. And they made the comment of they realized that they really don't like silence and can't sit in silence, right? And if you're familiar with 21 Pilots' car radio, right, the whole song, he's lamenting that his car radio has been stolen. And now he's driving in silence, and the silence is killing him, right? So he's thinking, I need to go get a car radio, when in reality, the silence is really what he needs, right? The silence is actually what we need. We need to get to the point where we can turn off the multitude of channels, not even be concerned that there's 57 or 157 channels or whatever, but that we're able to be released from that so that we can actually encounter God. Right? Because what the noise does, it keeps us from God, it keeps us distracted, and it keeps us enslaved. Right? And, over time, we become kind of willing participants in the enslavement. And we become addicted to the very things that are killing us. Right? So again, Zosima is going to get there. This is why I think this section of the novel is so important and it's so timely. So let's continue what he has to say. He goes on, he says, for the world says you have needs that are therefore satisfy them. For you have the same rights as the noblest and richest men, right? Now, he's talking about kind of class relationship. You have needs, therefore satisfy them. That's still, thinking in terms of class issues is still current today, but there's also other ways that statement, you have needs, satisfy them, right? You can think of any different types of needs that we might have and the different ways that we and others satisfy those needs. And the world encourages that, right? So he goes on, he says, do not be afraid to satisfy them, but even increase them. Right? This has been the message of the world. It's been the message of the evil one from the beginning. Right? The enticement to turn away from God and find our satisfaction in pleasure and in the senses and in the sensory world. Right? And we see it play itself out down through human history. We're continuing to see itself play play itself out in our own day and age.
I was gonna say, wasn't this like right around the time when serfdom got like abolished in Russia, and a lot of
Mhm.
people were like getting educations and
Yeah.
a lot more, and so like that would make sense.
Yeah.
Putting the brakes on some of the.
When Dostoevsky, it's interesting, but Dostoevsky was he was a proponent of ending
Oh,
serfdom.
yeah. I'm not saying that
Yeah.
was a problem. I just mean like so many people are like, now being given these new rights and given
Yeah.
these opportunities and moving to cities and everything like that. That I can see kind of what he's talking about.
Mhm.
Is being a warning to the otherwise the average people
Yeah.
might not have those opportunities.
And a lot of what Zosima is saying here, if you go back to the book that I recommended by St. Theophan, he's giving some of the same warnings to the young lady that moved to Moscow. Outside of the difficulty you're going to face from the people around you and the fact that most of them are just going to try to figure out how to use you in some way, there's also going to be a lot of things vying for your attention that will actually draw you away from the one thing needful, right? So again, even though Zosima is based off of St. Ambrose of the Optina Monastery, right? St. Ambrose wasn't saying anything different than St. Theophan was saying. St. Ignatius Bryanchaninov, who was writing right around the same time, right? They were all kind of giving the same warnings and advice to the people. Unfortunately, most of the people weren't listening, right? All right, so he goes on. He says, this is the current teaching of the world. I would argue it's always been the current teaching of the world. And in this, they see freedom. But what comes of this right to increase one's needs? For the rich, isolation and spiritual suicide. For the poor, envy and murder, for they have been given rights, but have not yet been shown any way of satisfying their needs. Right, so he talks about the dangers of both groups kind of satisfying their needs. For the rich, it leads to isolation and spiritual suicide, right? It separates them from their neighbor. And from the poor, it causes them to envy and hate the rich, right? Which again causes, right, isolation. They both kind of end up in the same place, isolated from one another. And so he continues, he says, we are assured that the world is becoming more and more united, is being formed into brotherly communion by the shortening of distances, by the transmitting of thoughts through the air. Right? He's talking about the telegraph at this point, the transmitting of thoughts through the air. Since that time, that ability has just proliferated, right? From the telegraph to radio signals to telephones to now cell phones and the internet and all that, right? So, and we're being promised that this is shortening the distance, and it's creating opportunities for us. That will actually lead to greater community. But he's going to go on and argue that's not actually what it does. It only drives further isolation. So he continues, he says, alas, do not believe in such a union of people. Taking freedom to mean the increase and prompt satisfaction of needs, they distort their own nature, for they generate many meaningless and foolish desires, habits, and most absurd fancies in themselves, right? Think of modern advertising. that really is, I mean, the goal of modern advertising is that thing right there. And from at least the late 19th century here in America and the early 20th century, advertising, that was their stated purpose. It's to create needs that don't exist, right? And the way that advertising is usually framed it's a message of salvation, right? You are suffering, and this is the thing that will save you, right? You're suffering from body odor, and therefore you have no relationships. If you go out and buy this body lotion, right? Think Axe for middle school students. It's going to solve all of your problems, and there are going to be more people than you can even, be able to handle that are going to want to be in relationship with you. That's kind of the message. And it's building on this desire for community, but it's not actually giving the solution. It's only creating further isolation and problem, right? So again, the timelessness of the novel is the fact that what Zosima is saying and what Dostoevsky is saying through Zosima is the timelessness of the truth of Christ over against the wisdom of this world, right? And again, this is why I think, in my opinion, this is the greatest Christian novel ever written. We could have a debate there, but I would vote for this one. So he goes on and he says, they live only for mutual envy, for pleasure seeking and self-display. To have dinners, horses, carriages, rank, and slaves to serve them is now considered such a necessity that for the sake of it, to satisfy it, they will sacrifice life, honor, the love of mankind, and will even kill themselves if they are unable to satisfy it, right? Big houses, nicest car, right? You just insert whatever it is today that stands in for horses and carriages and those things, right? We see the same thing in those who are not rich, while the poor so far simply drown their unsatisfied needs in envy and drink. But soon they will get drunk on blood instead of wine. They are being led to that. Dostoevsky was prophetic, right? Right now they're getting drunk on wine. There will come a day where the wine doesn't satisfy and they're going to get drunk on blood. And if we don't heed the warning, and this was Solzhenitsyn's warning to the West, right? If we don't heed the warning, right now our culture is getting drunk on all these different ways to try to satisfy the needs, but it's not going to satisfy it. And one day our culture will do the same thing that their culture did, and it will turn to being drunk on blood. Right? Because that is, again, if you're thinking of the way that the evil one works in the world, go all the way back to the beginning of Genesis. Right? He tricked Adam and Eve. They turned from God, right? They driven out of paradise, and they're living there on the edge of paradise in repentance. They have 2 sons, and all of a sudden Cain is envying his brother, right? Because his brother's sacrifice is found acceptable and his isn't. And what does he do? He kills his brother. Ultimately, that's the outcome. And it's been that way from the very beginning, right? And that's why in Scripture we're told, don't be surprised that the world hates you. Because, what we find in Christ is we find the antidote to the tempter and to the temptations that he brings to us. That doesn't mean it's a quick and easy pill, right? If only that was the case. It's a difficult healing that we undergo, but Christ is the antidote. He's the antidote for us personally. He's the antidote for what is ailing our culture. But so he continues. He says, I ask you, is such a man free? I knew one fighter for an idea who told me himself that when he was deprived of tobacco in prison, he was so tormented by this deprivation that he almost went and betrayed his idea just so that they would give him some tobacco. And such a man says, I'm going to fight for mankind. Well, how far will such a man get, and what is he good for? Perhaps some quick action, but he will not endure for long. And no wonder that instead of freedom, they have fallen into slavery. And instead of serving brotherly love and human unity, they have fallen, on the contrary, into disunity and isolation, as my mysterious visitor and teacher used to tell me in my youth. And therefore, the idea of serving mankind, of the brotherhood and oneness of people, is fading more and more in the world. And indeed, the idea now even meets with mockery. For how can one drop one's habits? Where will this slave go now that he is so accustomed to satisfying the innumerable needs he himself has invented? He is isolated, and what does he care about the whole? They have succeeding in amassing more and more things, but have less and less joy. Again, not only a description of 19th century Russia, but 21st century America, right? Very different is the monastic way. And I would hear, because again, Zosima's a monk talking to monks. We could insert very different is the Christian way. Because what he talks about here, being the life of the monastic, is not really any different than the life that we've been called to. The context that we live it out in looks differently. How we live it out might look differently, but we're called to the same thing, right? And the path really does involve these things for us as well as the monastics. Obedience, fasting, and prayer are laughed at, yet they alone constitute the way to real and true freedom. Look, this is true for all of us. Just as we said a moment ago, where he's talking about the enslavement that exists, right? The only way that we are able to be freed from that enslavement through Christ, right? He lays it out here. Obedience, fasting, and prayer. And that doesn't look different for those of us living in the world. I mean, the specific application. You're not obedient to an abbot or an abbess, right? But obedience, the virtue of obedience, first to Christ and the church, and then even to others, can free you from the tyranny of the self, right? And so even using, for us, obedience to, outside of the spiritual context, for those of you that have a job, right, you have a boss. Obedience to the boss is a way to be freed from the tyranny of the self. It's a way to fight against pride. And so again, the practice of obedience is a spiritual weapon given to us by Christ to fight against the things that enslave us. It is Christ who frees us, but the beauty of our understanding of the faith is we become co-workers with God, to use the language of Paul, right? We don't use weapons that we come up with ourselves. We use the weapons that God has given us, and we fight with the strength that he supplies. But we have to fight. And one of the ways that we fight against the tyranny of the self, one of the ways that we fight against enslavement to pleasure, and all the things that Zosima just listed, is through obedience. Same thing with fasting, right? And a lot of the obedience and fasting go hand in hand. When we come to a season like now, the Dormition fast, we like sometimes to think we're smarter than the church, right? Oh, what's the point? I don't really need to, it's great for monastics. It's great for the poor priest who's supposed to be doing it, but I can do it my own way. Well, that won't allow us to be freed from the slavery to our own selves, right? What self-love, which is our greatest enemy, right? And then prayer. So again, this is where, I want to cut to a moment where he says prayer is education. And we got some examples in this chapter and a little bit later of, praying for our neighbor, even praying for those that we don't know, right? Praying for those who have deceased, but there's no one there to remember them. And we talked a little bit about that last week. I want to share right after this. So I think this was Friday. It was actually your name day that this came up in the prologue of Word by St. Nikolai Velimirovich, right? I would highly recommend. You can get it on Kindle. It's inexpensive if you get it bound. The 2-volume set is really expensive.
Rocor has a free version.
Rocor has a free version online. You can also get it on Kindle and daily read the lives of the saints. St. Nikolai actually has poetry every day that he composed to go along with one of the saints of the day. He has contemplations, reflections, and a daily homily. So this was the prologue of Orad by, it's the life of the saints, but compiled by Saint Nikolai Velimirovich. The prologue. Yeah, and you can find different versions of the lives of the saints, the daily lives of the saints. I'm partial to the prologue myself. This is his reflection. And it was a reflection on prayer. So the saints that day, one of them was Saint Pontius, the other one was Saint Nona, right? And he's talking about their life of prayer and what God was able to accomplish in them and through them based on their life of prayer. So I want to read the reflection real quick to you. This is how Valerius begins the biography of his companion, Saint Pontius. Who can believe if God does not grant it, right? So again, faith is a gift of God. Who can lead a life of asceticism if the Lord does not help? Again, these things, obedience, fasting, and prayer, are not things that we do in our own strength. They're things that we do in the strength and grace that God has given us, but they are things that we do in cooperation with God, right? Because again, our understanding of salvation is therapeutic, which means just like this morning when Jackson went to the surgeon says, if you want to run again, you have to have hip surgery. Well, Jackson could say, no, I don't want to. Right? He could refuse. He could not cooperate with the physician, and in not cooperating with the physician, he's going to stay in the situation he's in, or it's going to get worse. Same thing with us when we come to Christ. Christ is a great physician, heals us, and as a great physician, sometimes he gives us prescriptions, things to do. Right? In the Sermon on the Mount, when you fast, when you pray, when you give to the needy. Those are prescriptions given by Christ that if we take them in cooperation with Christ, will bring spiritual healing. Does that make sense? Those acts don't save us. It's Christ that saves us. But we cooperate with him as he saves us by doing the things that he asks us to do. And so again, in the reflection, who can lead a life of asceticism if the Lord does not help? Who can receive the wreath of martyrdom if Christ does not give it? God can do all, and God wills all that is for the salvation of men, if only men pray to him. By prayer, Saint Nona converted her husband Gregory and her son Gregory, who had become known as the theologian, to Christianity. So by prayer, 2 saints were born. Her husband, actually you could say, Saint Nona is a saint as well. But her husband, Gregory, was a bishop before her son, Gregory, was a bishop and became known as Gregory the theologian. By prayer, 2 saints are born from the faithfulness and prayer of Saint Nona. By prayer, Monica brought Augustine out of a wayward life to the path of good works and faith. Again, another 2 mothers praying for their children. The most important thing we can do as parents, those of us that are parents, the most important thing we can do for our children is to pray for them. That's why we hear the injunction, talk more to God about your children than you do to your children about God. Doesn't mean we should never talk to our children about God. But, God's going to save them. We're not, right? So the most beneficial thing we can do for our children is to pray for them. By prayer, St. Basil converted his teacher Evulius. By prayer, King Hezekiah prolonged his life for 15 years. By prayer, St. Simeon the Stylite turned back the Persians and Scythians from attacking the land of Greece with an army already prepared. All the stars in the heavens could be more easily counted than all the miracles worked on earth by prayer. Right? You remember, again, going back to the 57 stations and nothing on, or my car radio now, I'm sitting in silence. Silence is actually a gift. And beautiful things can be born out of that silence. But all too often what happens is we want to drown it out. We want to entertain ourselves instead of using what's given to us, right? I wish for 21 Pilots they would see the car radio being stolen as a blessing and not as a curse, because it really is a blessing, right? Silence is a blessing. Prayer is a blessing. And through prayer, not only is it education for ourselves, but through prayer, we can be transformed And through our prayers, God can transform others as well. In prayer, really going back, obedience, fasting, and prayer, they're all interrelated. Just like in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, the three spiritual weapons that Christ gives us there, prayer, fasting, and giving to the needy, those aren't unrelated. We hear constantly that those three things go hand in hand, right? That it's prayer that empowers the other two. Fasting without prayer is meaningless. Going back to, like, if we're going to go through the door of mission fast and we're going to fast, but we're not going to pray along with it, we just, well, eat what we want to. If we're going to give to the needy, but it's not tied to prayer, again, giving to the needy becomes something else. Because when we fast along with prayer, or we give to the needy along with prayer, then those things become directed towards God, not towards ourselves or to something else. They become things that we're offering to God and that God gives back to us. It comes back to what happens in the liturgy, right? The liturgy, the work of the people. What are we doing in the liturgy? What do we do during the liturgy? We're praying. In peace, let us pray to the Lord. That's right. After blessed is the kingdom, the first thing we hear, in peace, let us pray to the Lord. And then we spend the next hour and a half praying for ourselves, praying for all mankind. And in the heart of the liturgy, thine own of thine own we offer unto thee, on behalf of all and for all. And what does God do with the gift that we offer? He gives it back. But he now has taken that gift and he's transformed it into himself. We offer him bread and wine, and in return, he gives us himself. This mutual exchange that goes on. That's what prayer is. Prayer is a mutual exchange between us and God, or the other way around. That's why true prayer, right? What we hear and what we're taught about prayer doesn't require a lot of words. Now, there might be a lot of words in the prayer, but it doesn't require a lot of words, because at its heart, what prayer is a giving over of ourselves to God and God giving himself in return. That's how prayer is education. Does that make sense? And the only antidote that we have to the things that we see going on in the world, which we see in ourselves as well, is that very thing right there, us giving ourselves over to God. And then God can transform that gift and give us back, so that in turn, we can then go into the world and maybe make a difference. The problem earlier on, right, these people talking about loving mankind, doing things for the benefit of mankind, is because they weren't doing it correctly. They thought they were the answer. They weren't the answer. Christ is the answer. And the only way someone can be a benefit of anybody else is if that person has first given themselves over to Christ. Otherwise, all that person is doing is wrapping the other person up in their own sickness. And that's what St. Theophan was warning that young lady about going to Moscow. When you go to Moscow, most people, they're wrapped up in themselves. And so when they engage with you, they're going to get you, the danger is you getting entwined in their own whirlwind. Be careful. And the only way to protect yourself from getting caught up in someone else's whirlwind is for you to first give yourself over to Christ. Then you might be able to step into someone's whirlwind and be of help. And that's what happens in the second half of the novel with Alyosha. He's able to make a difference because he's first given himself over to Christ. At the heart of it, though, right, was this struggle of, he thought the way for him to do that would be in the monastery. And God, through Zosima, had to kick him in the tail to get him out of the monastery, because that wasn't God's plan for Alyosha. And it goes back to what St. Nikolai says in the reflection, right, about God working through working through people. Saint Nona gave herself over to Christ, and Christ was able to use Saint Nona in the life of her husband and her son. Monica gave herself over to Christ, and Christ was able to use Monica in the life of Augustine. St. Basil gave himself over to Christ, and Christ has used St. Basil not only in his own day, but down to ours. Right? That's what is at the heart of what's going on here. Yes.
And like with Zosima and the odor, like who knows if Alyosha would have even left the monastery if that hadn't happened.
Right.
I'm sure. I guess you could say Zosima could take, he's a humble enough person to take the slander and whatever of all the people at the time and their doubt or whatever, but the greater thing to come was what Alyosha would do outside the monastery. So it was more than worth it for him to have that stain on his sainthood legacy or whatever.
Yeah. And again, this is one of the things we did discuss last week, right? Earlier on, Zosima had said, it's not miracles that produce faith, but it's faith that produces miracles. Right? And Alyosha was expecting a miracle. And when the miracle didn't happen, his faith was rocked. The real miracle that Alyosha experienced wasn't the incorrupt body of his elder. It was a miracle that happened between him and Grushenka. Right? When he opened himself up to her and she opened herself up to him. In forgiveness and true mercy, that was the miracle that he was not expecting. And that's what freed him from whatever doubt and delusions he was still holding on to. Was the miracle that he wasn't expecting. And it was only an onion, right, to use the imagery. But it's, if your faith, even if it's a mustard seed, right? If you have faith that's the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. And so out of that, Zosima now, instead of putting his faith in his elder, right, that got moved out of the way. So again, God's using Zosima to remove that, to truly help Alyosha come to faith. It's again, St. Nikolai, faith is something that's given to us by God. Usually in a way that we're not expecting it. And usually in a way that we're not looking for it. It usually hits us sideways. Right? So now let's turn to the chapter Cana of Galilee. This chapter is beautiful. So it's really short. So if you'll indulge, what we'll do is read it together and stop and talk. If something hits you, a thought or whatever hits you, please stop me and let's talk about it. But it's a beautiful chapter, right? For so many different reasons. So it's on page 359 of the old version. Let me see where it starts on. 381? 381 in the new version. It was very late by monastery rules when Alyosha came to the hermitage. The gatekeeper let him in by a special entrance. It had already struck 9, the hour of general rest and quiet, after such a troubled day for them all. Alyosha timidly opened the door and entered the elder's cell, where his coffin now stood. There was no one in the cell but Father Paisi, who was alone reading the gospel over the coffin, and the young novice Porphyry, who, worn out from the previous night's conversation and the day's commotion, slept a sound young sleep on the floor in the next room. Father Paisi, though he had heard Alyosha come in, did not even look up at him. Alyosha turned to the right of the door, went to the corner, knelt, and began to pray. His soul was overflowing, but somehow vaguely, and no single sensation stood out, making itself felt too much. On the contrary, one followed another in a sort of slow and calm rotation. But there was sweetness in his heart, and strangely, Alyosha was not surprised at that. Again, he saw this coffin before him, and this dead man all covered up in it, who had been so precious to him, but in his soul there was none of that weeping, gnawing, tormenting pity that had been there earlier in the morning. Now, as he entered, he fell down before the coffin as if it were a holy thing. But joy was shining in his mind and in his heart. The window of the cell was open, the air was fresh and rather cool. The smell must have become even worse if they decided to open the window, Alyosha thought. But even this thought about the putrid odor, which only recently had seemed to him so terrible and glorious, did not now stir up any of his former anguish and indignation. He quietly began praying, but soon felt that he was praying almost mechanically. Fragments of thoughts flashed in his soul, catching fire like little stars and dying out at once to give away to others. Yet there reigned in his soul something whole, firm, assuaging, and he was conscious of it himself. He would ardently begin a prayer. He wanted so much to give thanks and to love. But having begun the prayer, he would suddenly pass to something else, lapse into thought, and forget both his prayer and what had interrupted it. He tried listening to what Father Paisi was reading, but being very worn out, he began little by little to doze off. And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, read Father Paisi. And the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. Marriage? What was that? Marriage? Swept like a whirlwind through Alyosha's mind. There is happiness for her too. She went to the feast. No, she didn't take a knife. She didn't take a knife. That was only a pathetic phrase. Well, one should forgive pathetic phrases. One must. Pathetic phrases ease the soul. Without them, men's grief would be too heavy. Rakitin walked off into the alley. As long as Rakitin thinks about his grudges, he will always walk off into some alley. But the road is wide, straight, bright, crystal, and the sun is at the end of it. Ah, what are they reading? And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus saith unto them, they have no wine. Alyosha overheard. Ah, yes, I've been missing it, and I didn't want to miss it. I love that passage. It's Cana of Galilee, the first miracle. Ah, that miracle. Ah, that lovely miracle. Not grief, but men's joy Christ visited when he worked his first miracle. He helped men's joy. He who loves men loves their joy. The dead man used to repeat it all the time. It was one of his main thoughts. One cannot live without joy, says Mitya. Yes, Mitya. All that is true and beautiful is always full of all forgiveness. That too he used to say. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. Now, stopping there for just a minute, being in the Dormition fast, right? Thinking about the role of the Theotokos. This story, the wedding of Cana in Galilee in John chapter 2, right, is an apt description of what the Theotokos does for us. When we come to her and we ask for her intercessions like we did tonight in the Paraclesis service, right, she points us to her son. That's why you never see Mary in the Orthodox Church without Christ. She points us to her son, and these words echo, whatever he says, do it, right? Whatever our supplication may be, a part of her, certainly she intercedes on our behalf, but a part of what she's saying to us is, whatever he says, do that, right? And you will find mercy. If you do what he says, you'll find what you're looking for. It may not be the answer you're expecting, but you'll find what you're looking for. Right? So this exchange at the wedding of Cana in Galilee also should frame our own understanding. We are like the people at the wedding coming to her saying, our wine's running out. Will you please ask him to do something about it? And what does she do? She goes and she intercedes on their behalf, and then she comes back and she says, whatever he says, do it. That's what the Theotokos does for us. What she does there, she does for us now. It's the same thing what we just did tonight, asking, right, when we say, Most Holy Theotokos, save us. Well, her response to that is to go and intercede to her son and then come back to us and tell us whatever he says, do that. And you will find mercy, right? Couldn't leave that aside. That's an important part for us. And how apropos that we're reading the Cana of Galilee in the middle of the Dormition fast. Right? So now Alyosha's thoughts. Do it. Joy, the joy of some poor, very poor people. Why, of course they were poor. If there wasn't even enough wine for the wedding. Historians write that the people living around the lake of Gennesaret and in all those parts were the poorest people imaginable. And the other great heart of the other great being who was right there too, his mother, knew that he came down then not just for his great and awful deed, but that his heart was also open to the simple, artless merrymaking of some uncouth but guileless beings who lovingly invited him to their poor marriage feast. Mine hour is not yet come, he says with a quiet smile. He must have smiled meekly to her. Indeed, was it to increase the wine at poor weddings that he came down to earth? Yet he went and did what she asked. He's reading again. Jesus saith unto them, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he saith unto them, draw out now and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bear it. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and saith unto him, every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. But what's this? What's this? Why are the walls of the room opening out? Yes, this is the marriage, the wedding feast. Yes, of course. Here are the guests. Here are the newlyweds and the festive crowd. And where is the wise ruler of the feast? But who is this? Who? Again, the room is opening out. Who's getting up from the big table? What? Is he here too? Why, he is in the coffin, but here too. He has gotten up, he seems to me. He's coming over. Lord. Yes, to him he came, the little wizened old man with fine wrinkles on his face, joyful and quietly laughing. Now there was no coffin anymore, and he was wearing the same clothes as the day before when he sat with them and visitors gathered around him. His face was all uncovered, and his eyes were radiant. Can it be that he too is at the banquet, that he too has been called to the marriage in Cana of Galilee? I too, my dear, I too have been called and chosen, the quiet voice spoke over him. Why are you hiding here out of sight? Come and join us. His voice, the elder Zosima's voice. How could it be anyone else since he was calling? The elder raised Alyosha a little with his hand, and Alyosha got up from his knees. We are rejoicing, the little wizened man continued. We are drinking new wine, the wine of a new and great joy. See how many guests there are? Here are the bridegroom and the bride. Here's the wise ruler of the feast tasting the new wine. Why are you marveling at me? I gave a little onion, and so I am here. And there are many here who only gave an onion, only one little onion. What are our deeds? And you, quiet one, you, my meek boy, today you too were able to give a little onion to a woman who hungered. Begin, my dear, begin, my meek one, to do your work. And do you see our son? Do you see him? And the beauty of how our good deeds are described. They're nothing but a little onion, right? But there's so much in the giving of the onion. So much for us and so much of the one that we're giving it to. And what Christ is able to do with the onion is what he did with the wine. He's able to transform a meager action into something great and beautiful. Right? If only we do it in faith. So he continues, I'm afraid. I don't dare to look, whispered Alyosha. Do not be afraid of him. Awful is his greatness before us. Terrible is his loftiness. Yet he is boundlessly merciful. He became like us out of love, and he is rejoicing with us, transforming water into wine, that the joy of the guests may not end. He is waiting for new guests. He is ceaselessly calling new guests, now and unto ages of ages. See, they are bringing the new wine, the vessels being brought in. I like to think if you're a C.S. Lewis fan, right, and you think about Aslan and Lucy and them have heard about Aslan and what's the question? Is he safe?
Of course he's not safe.
Yeah, he's not safe, but he's good, right? I think C.S. Lewis had read Dostoevsky in this chapter, right, where you hear Zosima saying, awful is his greatness, terrible is his loftiness, yet he is boundlessly merciful, right? And he's seeking guests for the wedding feast unto ages of ages. And just like he came and called those guests into the kingdom, he's calling us as well. And we too can be a part of that wedding banquet. We too are being invited just like they were. So it continues, something burned in Alyosha's heart. Something suddenly filled him almost painfully. Tears of rapture nearly burst from his soul. He stretched out his hands, gave a short cry, and woke up. Again, the coffin, the open window, and the quiet, solemn, distinct reading of the gospel. But Alyosha no longer listened to what was being read. Strangely, he had fallen asleep on his knees, but now he was standing, and suddenly, as if torn from his place, with 3 firm, quick steps, he went up to the coffin. He even brushed Father Paisi with his shoulder without noticing it. The latter raised his eyes from the book for a moment, but looked away again at once, realizing that something strange was happening with the boy. For about half a minute, Alyosha gazed at the coffin, at the covered up, motionless dead man stretched out with an icon on his chest and the cowl with an 8-pointed cross on his head. A moment ago, he had heard his voice, and this voice was still sounding in his ears. He listened, waiting to hear more, but suddenly turned abruptly and walked out of the cell. He did not stop on the porch either, but went quickly down the steps. Filled with rapture, his soul yearned for freedom, space, vastness. Over him, and this is where I always get chills when we get to this point of the chapter. Over him, the heavenly dome, full of quiet, shining stars, hung boundlessly. From the zenith to the horizon, the still dim Milky Way stretched its double strand. Night, fresh and quiet, almost unstirring, enveloped the earth. The white towers and golden domes of the church gleamed in the sapphire sky. The luxuriant autumn flowers in the flower beds near the house had fallen asleep until morning. The silence of the earth seemed to merge with the silence of the heavens. The mystery of the earth touched the mystery of the stars. Alyosha stood gazing, and suddenly, as if he had been cut down, threw himself to the earth. He did not know why he was embracing it. He did not try to understand why he longed so irresistibly to kiss it, to kiss all of it, but he was kissing it, weeping, sobbing, and watering it with his tears. And he vowed ecstatically to love it unto ages of ages. Water the earth with the tears of your joy and love those tears, rang in his soul. What was he weeping for? Oh, in his rapture, he wept even for the stars that shone on him from the abyss, and he was not ashamed of this ecstasy. It was as if threads from all those innumerable worlds of God all came together in his soul, and it was trembling all over, touching other worlds. He wanted to forgive everyone and for everything, and to ask forgiveness, oh, not for himself, but for all and for everything. As others are asking for me, rang again in his soul, right? Thine own of thine own we offer unto thee in behalf of all and for all, right? The description of Alyosha going out in the dome, right? What's being described is the experience of walking into a church. But the offering, instead of bread and wine that Alyosha is making here, is the offering that every single one of us is called to make, and it's the offering of himself. Right? And in that moment, that his desire to forgive all and to be forgiven all, right? The echo that Dostoevsky is ringing here is the echo of the liturgy, but it also echoes Alyosha's experience. Zosima's experience. If you think back to when Scripture first made sense, the incense rising up, the sunlight coming in and meeting, right? And heaven and earth meet. And for Zosima, that was a transformative moment. For Alyosha, the same thing is happening here. It's a transformative moment. The silence of the heaven meets the silence of the earth. That's possible for us. It's certainly possible within the liturgy. But it's also possible for us, right, as we go about our daily lives, if we'll learn to embrace the silence. We won't be afraid of it. Because it's in the silence that we meet God. And it's in the silence that God reveals himself. That's the story of our own patron saints, Saint Elias, right? He goes out into the wilderness and he's waiting for God to show up. And there's a whirlwind. God's not in the whirlwind. There's an earthquake. God's not in an earthquake. And then there's a still small voice. Elias, Elias. Right? We look for God in the hustle and bustle. But we're not going to find him in the hustle and bustle. Right? We're going to find him in the silence. And when we come before Christ, what we're going to hear Christ saying to us is the invitation to the wedding feast. It's a beautiful chapter, right? And what happens to Alyosha, he gets up, right? He leaves, he's gone, and he's given himself over to Christ. And then the rest of the book is him giving himself over to his neighbors as it kind of works itself out with the schoolboys of the village. And so as the next couple of weeks, what we'll do is we'll explore that relationship that Alyosha develops with the schoolboys and what happens. And it'll culminate in a discussion, like I said, of Sheehan's article about memory eternal and how that really becomes the key for us of understanding the novel. Let me give you a blessing and we'll call it an evening. Thank you for indulging me. We haven't done a lot of read aloud, but couldn't help myself, these two parts. The blessing of the Lord and his mercy come upon you through his divine grace and love towards mankind, always, now, and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Thank you for taking time out of a busy week